It was early spring, and I was out on a remote camping trail with my dog, Jimmy. Jimmy was a young blue heeler, medium-sized, energetic, and constantly looking for something to do. I was still training him on hikes, so I usually chose trails that were easy to follow but far away from people. Some of them were so obscure they didn't even have reviews on the usual hiking apps. The isolation made training easier, and honestly, I enjoyed having the woods to ourselves. The campsite we hiked to that day was about 2 hours deep into the forest. It felt abandoned in a way that was hard to describe, as if people simply didn't come there anymore. Of all the places Jimmy and I had camped, this one felt the most isolated. The trees seemed taller, the silence heavier. Jimmy did great on the hike in. Even after we set up camp, he still had plenty of energy while I was completely exhausted. Once the sun disappeared behind the trees, I crawled into the tent and tried to get some sleep. For a few hours, everything seemed normal. Then Jimmy started acting strange. At first, I thought he was just restless, but it quickly became obvious that wasn't it. He wasn't acting like a dog that wanted to play or burn off energy. He seemed anxious. Every little sound made him lift his head. He kept shifting positions, staring toward the tent walls, unable to settle down. Eventually, around 3 hours after sunset, I unzipped the tent and let him outside, figuring he probably needed to go to the bathroom. But he didn't. Instead, he started circling the campsite. He would walk a few yards, stop, stare into the darkness, then continue. Every few seconds, he paused, almost like he was checking the perimeter. I'd never seen him behave like that before. It genuinely looked as though he was guarding something, or guarding me. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees surrounding camp. The beam bounced off trunks, bushes, and empty patches of forest floor. Nothing looked out of place. Still, the darkness felt unusually deep. I stayed outside with Jimmy for nearly 30 minutes. The entire time he remained alert, focused on something I couldn't see. Eventually, I convinced him to come back into the tent, though he clearly didn't want to. He hesitated at the entrance, looking back toward the woods before finally obeying. The rest of the night was miserable. I barely slept. Jimmy stayed awake almost the entire time, squirming, listening, occasionally lifting his head toward sounds I couldn't hear. His nervousness started affecting me. The longer it went on, the harder it became to convince myself there was nothing out there. Every rustle of leaves sounded important. Every creak of the trees seemed amplified. By morning, I was exhausted. When we finally stepped outside, Jimmy immediately resumed circling the campsite. That's when I noticed the marks. Behind the tent were strange disturbances in the dirt. At first glance, they looked like footprints, but none of them were clear enough to identify. It was more like someone had dragged their feet across the ground rather than actually stepped. As I looked around, I realized the marks weren't just behind the tent. They seemed to be scattered all around the campsite. I crouched down and studied them for several minutes. Maybe they were mine. That's what I kept telling myself. But the more I looked, the less certain I felt. If those marks had already been there when I set up camp, I felt like I would have noticed them. Then again, maybe I hadn't been paying attention. Lack of sleep wasn't helping my judgment. I couldn't decide what bothered me more, the possibility that they meant nothing, or the possibility that they didn't. I tried to shake it off and made breakfast while watching the sun rise through the trees. The warm morning light slowly filtered into the forest, and for a while things felt normal again. The woods seemed friendlier in daylight. After eating, Jimmy and I went for a short walk. There weren't any actual trails nearby, so we just wandered between the trees in a random direction. A few minutes in, Jimmy suddenly caught a scent. His entire posture changed. He became focused, moving quickly through the woods, while keeping his nose close to the ground. Whatever he was tracking had his complete attention. I followed him for a minute or two before he abruptly stopped. He began pacing around a single area near the base of a tree. Back and forth. Back and forth. It looked as though he had lost the trail. He kept sniffing the same patch of ground, clearly confused. After watching for a minute, I assumed he'd picked up the scent of a deer or some other animal and simply lost it. Eventually, I called him back and we returned to camp. But after we got back, something felt different. The forest had become unnaturally quiet. Not completely silent, but quiet enough that I noticed it. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning between the trees. It wasn't that I saw anything. It was the feeling that bothered me. That persistent sense that something was nearby, hidden just out of sight. I kept trying to find a reason for it. A sound, a movement, anything. But there was nothing. And somehow that made it worse. Jimmy seemed to feel it too. He refused to relax, pacing around camp and staring into the woods. Every time he froze and focused on a particular stretch of trees, I caught myself staring in the same direction, wondering if there was something out there watching us, or if whatever had made those marks during the night already knew we were there. By that point, Jimmy had been on edge for almost a full 24 hours. As evening approached and the sunlight began fading behind the trees, I could tell the constant vigilance was finally catching up to him. He looked exhausted. His movements were slower, and every now and then I'd catch him fighting to keep his eyes open. I built a campfire and tried to get him to lie down inside the tent for a while. I was worried he was going to completely wear himself out. He reluctantly settled down, though I could tell he wasn't actually relaxing. Even when his eyes started to close, he seemed to be listening. Watching him made me uneasy. Dogs get tired, dogs get distracted. But Jimmy had spent almost an entire day acting as though there was something nearby that he couldn't ignore. I sat beside the fire, occasionally poking at the burning logs, while the forest grew darker around me. The silence seemed heavier than it had the night before. No distant voices, no rustling animals, no wind moving through the trees. Just silence. The kind that makes you aware of every crackle from the fire. The hours crawled by. Around 10 o'clock, Jimmy suddenly lifted his head. The movement was so immediate and deliberate that it caught my attention right away. He wasn't waking up slowly. It looked like he'd heard something. Then a stick landed in the middle of the campsite. I actually flinched. Because I'd been looking at Jimmy when it happened, I didn't see where the stick came from. I immediately looked up into the trees, expecting maybe a branch had fallen. But nothing made sense. The trees weren't hanging over the campsite enough for that. And there wasn't any wind. Trying to suppress the growing knot in my stomach, I stood up and picked up the stick. Then I swept my flashlight across the darkness beyond the camp. Nothing. The forest remained pitch black and completely still. Then another stick came flying out of the darkness. This one landed directly in front of me, nearly bouncing into the fire. Every doubt disappeared instantly. Someone had thrown it. My heart started pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears. At the same moment, Jimmy came charging out of the tent. Despite how exhausted he had been only seconds earlier, he suddenly looked wide awake. He froze beside me, staring into the darkness directly ahead. Not searching, not sniffing around, just staring, locked onto something. I remember feeling completely torn between wanting to run and wanting to know what was out there. "Hello?" I shouted. "Who's out there?" No answer. I dug my flip knife out of my pocket and held it tightly in my hand. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 15 seconds. Nothing happened. The silence returned. The fear just kept building. Then Jimmy exploded. He started barking, growling, lunging back and forth so aggressively that it startled me. I looked down at him, expecting him to be focused somewhere ahead. Instead, he was looking up. My stomach dropped. I followed his gaze to a tree standing just outside the campsite. About halfway up the trunk, there was a person looking down at us. For a moment, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The figure appeared tall and extremely thin. What disturbed me most wasn't his appearance, though. It was how still he was. Completely still. No shifting, no climbing, no reaction. Almost as if he genuinely believed we couldn't see him. Or maybe he simply didn't care that we could. A wave of panic hit me. I took a slow step backward, then another. Without taking my eyes off the figure, I grabbed my backpack and reached down for Jimmy's collar. The man never moved. He just watched us. I kept backing away until we reached the trail leading out of the campsite. The figure remained perched in the tree the entire time, motionless against the darkness. Then, just as we reached the trail, I heard a heavy thump. It sounded like someone dropping from a height and landing on the ground. My blood ran cold. A second later came the sound of rapid footsteps crunching through leaves, not walking, running toward the campsite. I glanced back and saw him standing beside the fire. The flames illuminated him for only a moment, but I could clearly tell he was watching us. Watching to see what we'd do next. That was enough. I turned and ran. Jimmy stayed right beside me. Neither of us looked back again. We sprinted down the trail, fueled entirely by adrenaline and fear, and eventually made it back to the trailhead. Only then did I finally begin to feel like we might actually be safe. To this day, it's the creepiest thing I've ever experienced. I still don't know who that person was or what he wanted. Maybe there was some explanation for his behavior that I've never considered. But the way he acted never felt normal to me. The silence, the stalking, the sticks being thrown into camp, the way he sat motionless in that tree watching us. None of it felt right. What unsettles me most is the feeling that he had been aware of us long before we ever saw him. Looking back, I can't help wondering if Jimmy's strange behavior the entire trip was because he had been detecting that person all along. Maybe Jimmy knew someone was out there before I did. And if that's true, then I don't like thinking about how long we might have been watched. One thing I am certain about is that having Jimmy with me changed that situation. Whether the stranger was simply trying to scare us or had something worse in mind, Jimmy made it clear that we weren't easy targets. Without him there, I honestly don't know how that night would have ended. Last year, my sister and her fiancé went overseas to celebrate their anniversary. They had a small dog named Milo that they obviously couldn't bring with them, so I offered to watch her for the 2 weeks they'd be gone. Honestly, I was happy to do it. The added bonus was getting to stay at their house. It was a beautiful ranch-style home tucked near a wooded area. It felt private and peaceful without being completely isolated. You could still get into town within a few minutes, but at night it was quiet enough that you felt separated from everything else. Milo made the whole arrangement incredibly easy. She was probably the easiest dog I've ever looked after. She spent most of the day lounging around, rarely made a sound, and followed me from room to room like a tiny shadow. Since I worked remotely at the time, I barely noticed the extra responsibility. Every morning I'd set up my laptop at a small desk in the guest bedroom, and Milo would curl up on the bed behind me and sleep while I worked. The first few days passed without anything unusual happening. On Friday evening, I had a video call with my sister to let her know everything was going fine. After that, Milo and I spent the rest of the night watching TV before heading to bed. Looking back, that was probably the last normal night. Before turning in, I let Milo outside one final time. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. The house didn't have a fenced yard, just a large stretch of grass surrounded by scattered trees and brush. Normally, Milo loved wandering around before bed. She'd sniff every corner of the yard and take her time coming back inside. That night, she barely stepped away from the porch. She hurried out, did her business, and immediately turned around. No exploring, no sniffing, no lingering. She practically ran back to the door. At the time, I assumed there was probably a coyote nearby, or maybe some other animal she had smelled. It seemed like a reasonable explanation, so I didn't think much about it. About 10 minutes later, I was upstairs taking a shower when I heard the doorbell ring. Just once. Even over the sound of the water, I was positive I'd heard it. I quickly finished up, got dressed, and headed downstairs. When I checked the front door, nobody was there. The porch was empty. As far as I could tell, there weren't even any cars in the driveway. I checked the time, a little after 10 p.m. The whole thing felt odd. Who rings a doorbell that late and leaves before anyone answers? Especially at a house tucked back like this. I stood there for a minute before eventually deciding it was probably nothing. Maybe someone had the wrong address. Maybe I'd heard something else. I started heading back upstairs. Then I heard a noise outside. I stopped. Milo was standing beside me. She let out a soft whine. That immediately got my attention because Milo almost never whined, not even when she wanted food or attention. Then, a few seconds later, the doorbell rang again. This time I went straight to the door and looked through the peephole. There was a man standing on the porch. For some reason, he looked vaguely familiar. Not familiar enough that I recognized him, just enough to create that uncomfortable feeling that I'd seen him somewhere before. I watched him silently for a few seconds. Then he called out, "Ashley, Ashley, you home?" My sister's name. Hello? Something about the way he said it bothered me. Maybe it was because of the hour. Maybe it was because he sounded too comfortable standing there. Or maybe it was because Milo had suddenly moved closer to me. I opened the door just a crack. The man's face remained completely neutral at first. Then his eyes dropped to Milo. He stared at her. Not for a second. Long enough that I noticed. Then he looked back at me and forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey," he said. "Is Ashley home?" "No," I replied. "She's out of town." The smile faltered slightly. "Do you know her?" I asked. "And why are you here this late?" He nodded and apologized, explaining that he was a friend who happened to be in the area and thought he'd stop by. The explanation sounded normal enough, but standing there in that moment, it didn't feel normal. As he spoke, I became aware of how quiet everything around us was. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic, just silence. Then I noticed a vehicle parked far back in the driveway, so far back that it blended into the darkness. That struck me as strange immediately. If he was really just stopping by to visit a friend, why park where the house couldn't easily see his car? The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Then he crouched down. "Hey there, Milo." His attention shifted back to the dog almost instantly. He reached a hand forward as if he wanted to pet her. Without even thinking about it, I stepped forward and blocked Milo with my leg. Something about the way he was looking at her put me on edge. I couldn't explain why. It was just a feeling. But every instinct I had told me not to let him get close to her. "It's pretty late," I said. "And like I said, Ashley isn't here. Maybe send her a text next time." For a split second, his expression changed. The friendliness disappeared. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. He looked irritated, almost offended, as though I'd interrupted whatever he had expected to happen. Then the smile returned. "Alrighty," he said. He stood up and began walking back toward the darkness. I watched him the entire way. And even after he disappeared into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't come to see Ashley at all. The way he'd looked at Milo, the way he'd parked, the way he'd seemed disappointed when he realized he wasn't getting any closer. None of it sat right with me. At the time, I told myself I was probably overthinking it. But deep down, I had the uncomfortable feeling that whatever had just happened wasn't a coincidence, and that it wasn't the last time I'd be seeing him. "I'll let her know you stopped by," I said as I started closing the door. As soon as those words left my mouth, the man paused. Just for a second. It looked like he was considering saying something else. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Without another word, he turned and continued walking toward his car. I locked the door immediately and stood there watching him the entire time. Only when I saw him get into his vehicle and drive away did I finally relax. Even then, something about the encounter kept bothering me. I pulled out my phone to text my sister. Halfway through typing the message, I realized I hadn't even asked for the guy's name. That seemed strange in hindsight. I ended up just sending a quick text explaining that some man had stopped by asking for her. Because of the time difference where she was traveling, I knew I probably wouldn't hear back for several hours, so I didn't think much more about it. Eventually, I headed upstairs and got into bed. Despite everything that had happened, I was tired enough to fall asleep within 20 minutes. The next thing I remember is waking up suddenly. At first, I wasn't even sure what had awakened me. The room was completely dark, pitch black. For a few seconds, I just lay there trying to orient myself. Then I reached over toward the nightstand to check the time on my phone. It wasn't there. I frowned and started feeling around the LayOS. Nothing. That was strange. I always left my phone in the same place before going to sleep. Before I could think much more about it, I heard a sound. A quiet whine. Milo. The noise immediately put me on edge. Milo almost never made a sound. Not when she wanted food. Not when she wanted attention. If she was whining, something was wrong. I turned toward the corner of the room where her dog bed was. At first, I couldn't make out much. The darkness was too thick. Then I saw movement. A shape. Someone was standing there. For a split second, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. Then pure panic hit me. I jumped out of bed and lunged toward the light switch. The room flooded with light. And there he was. A man, standing only a few feet away from me. Close enough that he could have reached out and touched me. I still get chills thinking about it. He was bent over, reaching for Milo. She was trying to pull away, but he already had one hand on her. Even though he was dressed entirely in dark clothing, I recognized him immediately. It was the same guy from the front porch. The realization made my stomach drop. This hadn't been some random late-night visit. Whatever his intentions were, he'd come back. And somehow he'd gotten inside the house without waking me up. The man grabbed Milo and lifted her off the floor. What disturbed me most was how calm he seemed. No panic, no surprise, no hesitation. Almost like he'd expected this moment. He looked directly at me, still holding Milo. Then he said one word. "Move." That's all. Just move. I was standing in the bedroom doorway, blocking the only obvious exit. There was no way I was stepping aside. Not after seeing him holding the dog. Not after finding him standing over us while we slept. I remember my heart pounding so hard that it felt painful. The guy looked bigger than me. A lot bigger. I didn't see any weapons, but that honestly didn't make me feel any better. The look on his face scared me more than a weapon would have. There was no nervousness, no fear, no uncertainty, just anger. Cold, controlled anger. "Put the dog down," I told him. "I'll let you leave." He didn't respond. He just kept walking toward me. Slowly, like he'd already decided how this was going to end. That's when I realized talking wasn't going to work. I didn't really have a plan. I just reacted. As soon as he got close enough, I drove my shoulder into him while reaching for Milo. The collision knocked all of us off balance. My name is Leo, and I'm 29 years old. This happened about 3 years ago. At the time, I lived alone in a small, older house on the outskirts of town. Behind my backyard was a huge stretch of woods, roughly 15 square miles of dense trees and brush. It wasn't the kind of place with hiking trails or campsites. There was nothing back there at all. At least, not that I knew of. Most people in town never went into those woods. Honestly, I don't think there was any reason to. I'd lived in that house for about a year when I first saw her. One evening, I stepped outside onto my porch and immediately noticed a dog curled up beside my front door. She was pressed tightly against the wall of the house as if she was trying to make herself invisible. The poor thing looked terrified. She was shaking, dirty, and painfully thin. I later learned she was a border collie, but at the time she was just a scared stray dog sitting on my porch. I wouldn't have called myself a dog person back then. But seeing her like that made my heart sink. I went back inside, grabbed a bowl of water and some leftovers from the refrigerator, then brought them outside. She devoured the food immediately. But every time I took a step closer, she flinched and pulled away. It was obvious someone, or something, had taught her not to trust people. I figured she belonged to somebody and had gotten lost. Maybe she'd escaped a yard somewhere nearby. I assumed her owners would eventually come looking for her. For about an hour, I sat on the porch with her. Then, without warning, she suddenly stiffened. Her ears perked up. She stared into the darkness beyond my yard. The change was so abrupt that I remember looking around myself. A second later, she jumped up and bolted, not casually running off. She sprinted straight into the darkness. Within moments, she was gone. That was my first encounter with her. The strange thing was that she came back. The next night, she was on my porch again, and the night after that. Then the night after that. For an entire month, I found her there almost every evening. It became a routine. I'd come home, and sooner or later she'd appear on the porch. I contacted animal services several times, hoping they could help her. But every time someone was scheduled to come out, she'd disappear before they arrived. It was almost like she knew. Eventually, after weeks of patience, she started trusting me. Little by little, she let me get closer. Then one night, she finally followed me inside. Once she was indoors, I managed to keep her there until the rescue team arrived the next morning. I went with them to the veterinarian's office. Seeing her there changed something for me. She was still nervous around everyone else, trembling whenever someone unfamiliar approached. Yet whenever she looked at me, she seemed calmer, safer. I can't really explain it. All I know is that when they asked if I wanted to adopt her, I couldn't bring myself to say no. I named her Wiley and brought her home. For the rest of the day, I watched her slowly explore the house. She moved cautiously from room to room, sniffing everything and jumping at the smallest unexpected sound. But she seemed happier. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked like she was beginning to relax. That night, I spread out a pile of blankets on the floor beside my bed and let her sleep there. After the long day we'd had, I fell asleep almost immediately. Then I woke up to knocking. Loud knocking. The sound echoed through the house. For a moment I was disoriented, trying to figure out where I was. Then I glanced at the clock. A little after 2:15 a.m. I sat upright and immediately noticed Wiley. She was huddled in the corner of the room, shaking, terrified. The sight instantly reminded me of the first night I'd found her on the porch. Whatever had frightened her before was back, or at least that's what it felt like. The knocking continued. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone was at my front door. I remember staring toward the hallway, trying to make sense of it. Who would be knocking on someone's door at 2 a.m, and why? Still half asleep, I got out of bed and headed downstairs. Wiley didn't follow. That bothered me. Over the previous few days, she'd started following me everywhere. But now she refused to leave the room. I approached the front door and looked outside. At first, I didn't see anyone. The porch was empty. Then I noticed movement. A shadow shifted near the far side of the porch, close to the living room window. Someone was standing there, or maybe leaning against the house. It looked like they were trying to peer through the glass. A chill ran through me. I considered walking over to the window for a better look, but fear stopped me. Something about the situation felt wrong. So I stayed where I was and watched from the safety of the doorway. A few moments later, I heard footsteps moving along the side of the house. Then silence. Whoever it was had left. At least, I hoped they had. I never actually saw their face. I never found out whether it was a man or a woman. I just knew someone had been standing outside my house in the middle of the night, watching. That realization was enough to keep me downstairs for quite a while afterward. I checked the windows repeatedly and listened for any sign that they might return. Nothing happened. By around 2:30, I finally convinced myself it was over and went back upstairs. Wiley seemed calmer by then, but she still looked unsettled. I climbed back into bed and eventually fell asleep. When morning came, I tried to convince myself the whole thing had been some random incident. Maybe someone was drunk. Maybe they had the wrong house. Maybe there was a perfectly normal explanation. The problem was Wiley. Over the next 2 weeks, She continued having those same strange episodes, and the more often they happened, the harder it became to believe they were random. Usually, when I let Wiley out into the backyard, she'd act completely normal at first. She'd wander around, sniff the grass, explore along the fence line, typical dog behavior. Then something would change. Almost always at night, right before bed, she'd suddenly stop moving altogether. She would turn toward the woods behind my house and freeze. Not pause, freeze. It was like someone had hit a switch. I'd stand at the back door watching her, expecting her to continue walking after a few seconds. But she never did. She would remain perfectly still, staring over the fence into the darkness beyond. The woods were so dark at night that my eyes couldn't penetrate them. It was just a solid wall of blackness. And yet, Wiley seemed to be looking at something. Something specific. I never saw anything out there. Not once. No movement, no lights, no sounds, nothing. But Wiley would stare for minutes at a time, completely unresponsive. I'd call her name and get no reaction. Sometimes I'd walk into the yard and physically touch her before she'd even acknowledge I was there. The worst part was the fear. You could see it in her. Her body would tremble, her ears would flatten, sometimes her tail would tuck so tightly underneath her that it looked painful. Whatever she thought was out there terrified her. Eventually, I'd have to pick her up and carry her back inside because she was too frightened to move on her own. After enough nights of this, I stopped believing it was random behavior. Dogs can act strangely sometimes, sure. But this happened over and over again. Wiley was reacting to something. Whether I could see it or not, she clearly could. And whatever it was scared the hell out of her. Then came the 15th night after I'd officially adopted her. Looking back, that was when everything changed. I let her out before bed like usual. At first, nothing seemed different. Then she froze again. I watched her through the kitchen window. For some reason, I remember feeling uneasy almost immediately. I couldn't explain why. Nothing looked different. But something felt wrong. The air felt heavier. The yard felt quieter. I found myself staring into the woods right alongside Wiley, waiting. Then suddenly she bolted. Not toward the house, toward the fence. She sprinted across the yard, launched herself over the top, and disappeared into the woods. For a second, I just stood there in shock. Then panic kicked in. I grabbed a flashlight and ran after her without even thinking. To this day, I still can't believe I did that. Running into miles of dark woods at night after a terrified dog was probably one of the dumbest decisions I've ever made. At the time, though, I was only thinking about Wiley. I reached the tree line and immediately spotted her farther ahead. My flashlight barely caught her silhouette weaving between the trees. "Wiley!" I yelled. She stopped for a moment. I ran toward her. Then she took off again, deeper into the woods. The same thing happened over and over. Every time I got close, she'd move farther away. Far enough to stay visible, never far enough to disappear completely. It almost felt intentional, like she wanted to make sure I kept following her. The thought crossed my mind several times. I remember wondering if she was actually leading me somewhere, or if I was just desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. By my estimate, I chased her for nearly 2 miles through those woods. The entire time, my flashlight bounced between tree trunks and shadows, creating the constant illusion that something was moving just outside my field of vision. Finally, Wiley stopped running. This time she stayed put. As I approached, my flashlight caught something standing behind her. At first, I thought it was another cluster of trees. Then the shape became clearer. A structure, a small wooden cabin, or maybe a shack. It looked ancient. The boards were warped and rotting. Parts of the roof appeared partially collapsed. The entire building looked abandoned. My stomach immediately tightened. Nothing about it belonged there. I had lived beside those woods for over a year and had never known it existed. For a moment, I seriously considered turning around and leaving. But then I looked at Wiley. She wasn't running anymore. She was waiting. And after everything that had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd brought me there for a reason. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was projecting meaning onto a scared dog's behavior. But standing there in the darkness, that explanation felt impossible to ignore. I approached the shack and pushed open the door. The hinges let out a long, screeching groan that echoed through the trees. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Inside, the building was mostly empty. At first, I thought there was nothing there at all. Then my flashlight beam swept across the back wall, and I saw another dog. It was smaller than Wiley and a completely different breed. A collar around its neck was attached to the wall by a length of rope. The animal looked terrified, shaking, skinny, exhausted. The sight instantly reminded me of Wiley when I'd first found her on my porch. My heart sank. I hurried over and loosened the collar enough for the dog to slip free. As soon as it was loose, it backed away, but didn't run. I remember standing there, trying to process what I was looking at. Questions kept piling up in my head. Who put the dog here? Why? How long had it been trapped? And where was whoever owned this place? The last question frightened me the most. I turned to look at Wiley. She hadn't moved. She was standing in the doorway, completely rigid, frozen, the exact same way she'd freeze in the backyard. I called her name. Nothing. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring into the trees, into the darkness beyond the shack. Then I heard it. Footsteps, faint at first. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone was walking through the woods, toward us. Every hair on my body stood up. The footsteps weren't wandering randomly. They sounded deliberate, steady, closing the distance. The realization hit me all at once. Whoever had tied that dog up could be coming back. I didn't wait around to find out. I scooped Wiley into my arms and ran. The smaller dog followed behind us. Branches slapped against my face as I sprinted through the darkness. My flashlight beam bounced wildly between the trees while the sound of my own breathing filled my ears. I kept expecting to hear someone running after us. Kept expecting to see another flashlight behind me. Thankfully, I never did. After about half a mile, I put Wiley down. She immediately started running beside me under her own power. Together, we made our way back toward the edge of my property. When we finally reached the tree line behind my backyard, I looked around for the second dog. It was gone. I searched for a few minutes, but never found it. Part of me worried about what had happened to it, but I like to think it escaped and found its way somewhere safer. Once Wiley and I were back inside, I locked every door in the house. Then I called the police. Officers arrived that night to take my report, and the following day, they went into the woods to investigate the shack. What they found out there was something I never could have predicted. The police went out to investigate the following day. When they reached the shack, it was different from how I'd found it. More abandoned. The dog was gone. There was no sign of anyone living there. No belongings, no evidence that could identify who had been using the place. And whoever I'd heard walking toward us that night had disappeared as well. It was as if the entire place had been erased overnight. The officers searched the area and asked me plenty of questions, but ultimately, nothing ever came from it. No arrests, no suspects, no clear answers. The whole thing remained a mystery. For a while, that bothered me. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out what I'd actually stumbled into. Who was that person? Why were dogs being kept out there? How long had it been happening? And perhaps most importantly, why had Wiley spent weeks staring into those woods in terror? I never found any definitive answers, but there was one thing I couldn't ignore. After that night, Wiley changed. Completely. The freezing episodes stopped. Every single one of them. Before, she would regularly stand in the backyard, staring into the woods as though she sensed something approaching. Sometimes she would become so terrified that I'd have to physically carry her back into the house. After the shack incident, it never happened again. Not once. She would run around the yard, chase squirrels, sniff along the fence, and act like a normal dog. The fear was gone. That fact alone has always stuck with me. Maybe there's a logical explanation for it. Maybe it was all a coincidence. But I've never really believed that. The conclusion I keep coming back to is that Wiley knew whoever that person was. Maybe she had escaped from him. Maybe she'd been kept at that shack before finding her way to my porch. And maybe every night when she'd freeze and stare into the woods, she wasn't reacting to some imaginary threat at all. Maybe she knew he was out there, watching, waiting, getting as close to the property as he dared. I sometimes think back to the night I woke up to the knocking at my front door. At the time, I assumed it was just some random stranger. Now I'm not so sure. Part of me wonders if it was him. Maybe he had finally tracked Wiley down. Maybe he was looking through the window, trying to see whether she was inside. I'll never know. What I do know is that after I found the shack, whoever had been out there never came back. At least, not that I ever noticed. 3 years have passed since then. Wiley is still with me. And honestly, after those first strange weeks, I couldn't have asked for a better dog. She's loyal, smart, affectionate, and somehow seems to know exactly when I need company after a bad day. Looking at her now, it's hard to imagine the frightened animal I found curled up on my porch all those years ago. Sometimes I'll sit outside at night and look toward the woods behind the house. They're still there, dark, quiet, keeping their secrets, and every now and then I find myself wondering what would have happened if Wiley had never jumped that fence. What if I hadn't followed her? What if I'd ignored my instincts and stayed home that night? Maybe nothing would have changed. Or maybe that man would have continued creeping through those woods, coming closer to my backyard night after night. Maybe Wiley would have spent the rest of her life terrified every time the sun went down. I'll never know the answer. But I do know one thing. The night I followed Wiley into those woods, she wasn't the one being rescued anymore. In a strange way, I think she was leading me to the truth. And maybe, just maybe, she was trying to save both of us.